Good morning, everybody. I've been advised to stand close to the microphone so that you can hear me better. So I'm going to try to do that. Hello, Mike. So, buongiorno, everybody. I'm delighted to be talking to you this morning about the evidence for beaker-related social practices in Ireland, and to look at how this offers a useful perspective on some of the wider issues we encounter in trying to understand the broader beaker phenomenon. Almost 20 years ago, I was studying for a master's in Belfast, and I was obsessed with beakers. I am now cured of this. But I was particularly interested in the Irish manifestation of this. And I remember buying these two beautiful books. I remember them because they were beautiful, but also quite expensive. And I didn't have a lot of money at the time. So it's wonderful to be here today. Thank you to the organizer for the excellent conference, and thank you to the person who suggested inviting me. It feels like things have come full circle. Now, when I was younger, I was really eager to explain why the Irish manifestation of the beaker phenomenon seemed to be so different to everywhere else. The traditional view was that Ireland was really rich in settlement remains, yet lacking in a funerary component. Of course, the reality is more complex, as you will see. It's true that beaker pottery is mainly found in non-funerary contexts in Ireland, within pits or spreads. There are some beaker-associated burials, but these mainly occur in newly built communal megalithic monuments known as wedge tombs. We have lots of the non-ceramic objects that typically occur with beaker burials elsewhere. For example, over 100 wrist bracers and 20 tang copper daggers. But these are mainly found in non-funerary contexts, in so-called natural places, particularly bogs. Now that I'm older and hopefully wiser, I've come to realize that this Irish scenario, this difference, isn't something to be explained away, but to be celebrated. The beaker complex resists definition precisely because its most defining characteristic is its regional variability. Multiple factors, particularly the stereotypical beaker burial, gave us the false impression of uniformity. And of course, it's now recognized, as Martin and others have highlighted, that the idea of a beaker culture was only invented over a century ago, and that this modern unit of classification may not reflect past reality very accurately. One legacy of this, however, is that we often use the term beaker as kind of ambiguous shorthand, sometimes to refer interchangeably to pottery, to other artifacts, to burials, to cultural units, to time periods, and even sometimes population groups. Problematically, this uncritically couples together a wide range of objects and practices. And residual issues like this can often be amplified by new scientific techniques. And this brings me back to David Clarke's statement from quite some time ago, where he said, "There we suspect that the beaker problem is a philosophical artifact of our own manufacture." And I think this still has some relevance for us still today. But let's return to the Irish evidence. And before we go any further, I want to give you kind of a brief chronological framework for the points I'm going to make. So around 3300 BC, we have the peak of the construction of passage tombs like those you will know in the Boyne Valley, like Knout and Newgrange. Then, around 3000 BC, we have the adoption of grooveware pottery, which you would have heard about from Mike as well yesterday. And then this is replaced by beaker pottery around 2450 BC, and at the same time, we see the advent of copper and gold working and the construction of these new type of megalithic tombs, which we call wedge tombs. Then, around 2200 BC, we see the creation of a new type of pottery its use is contemporaneous with that of beakers. These are known as food vessels, or sometimes also as Irish bowls and vases. And you might notice that I'm deliberately trying not to use our traditional chronological terminology here, because they can give a false impression of changes. Of change only happening suddenly at either the beginning or end of a period. And this can mask some of the really interesting shorter and longer term processes, which we see These processes which indicate that people were adopting and adapting lots of new ideas and things throughout the 3rd millennium BC, but they were often hybridizing these in accordance with longer-standing ways of doing things. This point is very nicely illustrated by the evidence for early copper metallurgy in Ireland. So as many of you will know, all early Irish copper comes from a single source, Ross Island in the southwest of Ireland. And this is very similar to the way that most of the stone axes from the 4th millennium in Ireland came from one or two sources in the northeast of Ireland, and they were all made from a stone called porcelainite, which I'll refer to again in a few minutes' time. At Ross Island, we see that the copper mining there was conducted in association with the use of beaker pottery, and we also see that this copper was used for many of the copper objects in early British beaker-associated burials. Now, really interesting, although obviously copper can be used to make objects of any shape, in Ireland we see an exceptionally strong emphasis on both the production and the deposition of copper flat axe heads. For example, we have over 450 copper axes in Ireland compared to just 20 tang copper daggers. And really interesting again, most of these copper axes have been found deposited in natural wet places, in single type or what we might call one type hoards. And this very much seems to be respecting the pre-existing custom of depositing supra-regional stone axes in exactly the same way that had existed throughout the 4th millennium and earlier 3rd millennium BC. But of course, it's important to note that the technological knowledge required for the earliest copper metallurgy in Ireland would have been embodied. It would have required the arrival of people with the expertise needed. And we can now say for definite that people were moving between continental Europe, Britain and Ireland during the latter half of the 3rd millennium BC, and that at least some of those people were newcomers with a different genetic ancestry to the pre-existing populations. Now, much work is still needed to understand the character and the scale of mobility at this time. There's questions about the timing, the pace and duration, which I'm sure Ian will talk to us more about tomorrow. And there's also questions about the relationship between genetic and other kinds of changes, some of which may have been overstated. But it's important to highlight that this evidence for mobility does not by itself fully explain how or why the adoption of new ideas, objects, and practices occurred in the ways that they did. As you will see, in Ireland, newcomers and locals mixed, interacted, and negotiated their similarities and differences in quite diverse ways. Now, Humphrey Case, who was here at the last Riva del Garda conference but is no longer with us, consistently highlighted that Ireland was a melting pot where the Eastern and the Western beaker traditions collided. And this is very much obvious in the Irish beaker ceramics, which show influences from various parts of Europe. We see in the non-ceramic beaker-related artifacts, some of these show clear Atlantic affinities in terms of the sun discs, the diadems, the bands, the basket-shaped ornaments. We have thick-butted and tin-butted copper axes, which speak of Eastern and Western European influences. We have barbed and tanged and also hollow-bait stone arrowheads, which again speak with different parts of Europe. Interestingly, in terms of the wrist bracers, we see that in Ireland, these are very much predominantly of the two-hold variety, but mainly occur in the red or black in colour, which is much more typical of the four-hold examples known from Central Europe. And this tells us that there was a complex set of direct and indirect links between Ireland and various other regions at this time. Beaker pottery in Ireland was made from local materials, and this is true of many of the other beaker-related objects found on the island. Now, prior to the 1990s, there were not so many sites with beaker pottery known, but then in the 90s and the noughties, we had a boom in archaeological excavations conducted in advance of construction, and this has significantly altered our knowledge of the number of beaker sites that we have. So we can now say that beaker pottery has been discovered across much of the island of Ireland. There's over 150 sites, and these indicate that from an early stage, this pottery was extensively used for a wide range of both everyday and special purposes. We can now say that beakers in Ireland mainly occur in occupational debris in a highly fragmentary condition. So alongside food remains, bits of stone tools, querns, scrapers, arrowheads, polished stone axes, and hammerstones. And most of this occurs within pits or spreads. And we're talking about spreads, we call them middens or so on. Here in this picture, we're looking at the example of the contents of one of these beaker pits and the kind of occupational debris that it occurs alongside. Now, these sites, the pits and the spreads, are generally regarded as representing settlement activity in these locations. The condition and the treatment of the pottery indicates that they had been broken for some time before being deliberately gathered up and subsequently deposited in these locations. We see just a few shards from multiple different vessels. Some of these deposits relate to formalized ceremonial activity, but it's very difficult to distinguish between the domestic and the ritual at this time. Houses from the mid-3rd millennium do not appear to have left a lasting trace, and only a few examples with beaker pottery have been identified. And importantly, this strongly echoes the character of the settlement evidence from the first half of the 3rd millennium BC that was associated with grooved-ware pottery in Ireland. And interestingly, beaker pottery in Ireland seems to rapidly replace grooved-ware. But although it rapidly replaces it, it seems to very much take on the role of grooved-ware. So this is really obvious when we look at timber circles and the practices associated with them. So timber circles, Mike talked about them a bit yesterday. This is this type of wooden monument broadly dating from 2700 to 2500 BC in an Irish context. And these were no longer being constructed by the time that beaker pottery is being used, but we often find beaker pottery in association with them. And in some cases, we see that the beaker pottery has been placed into the top of the post holes of these abandoned timber circles. And here we see two examples of this at Paulstown and Armaluhi, where deposits of occupational debris have been placed into the top of the post holes in exactly the same manner as grooved-ware had before this. And when we look at grooved-ware associated deposits at these monuments, we see that it's very rule-bound, very codified. There's nearly always a deep positional emphasis upon the central elements, the entrance area, the area to the rear directly opposite the entrance, and also the area to the right-hand side as you enter. And at both these sites, at Armaluhi and Paulstown, we see beaker pottery being deposited in exactly the same way. They are following the rules of grooved-ware deposition. Then, if we turn to some earlier Neolithic monuments, we see that at the developed passage tombs at Knout and Newgrange, we see beaker pottery was being placed in deposits overlying grooved-ware outside the entrance to these monuments. And really importantly, these deposits that we see there were part of a much longer sequence of ceremonial activities that had been emphasizing the exterior of those monuments throughout the latter part of the 4th millennium and earlier 3rd millennium, and continue without change after the adoption of beaker pottery. And this very clear concern with the past is exemplified by the placement of a beaker pot inside Tomb 15 at Knout. And this is very unusual because we see this beaker pot, an undecorated beaker pot, occurring alongside cremated human remains dating from 2900 to 2800 BC. And significantly, this is the only beaker pottery from the interior of an Irish passage tomb. And again, this signals this awareness of this pre-existing tradition of mainly depositing ceramics outside rather than inside these monuments. Now, if we turn our attention to earlier Neolithic megalithic monuments, those known as portal and court tombs that were first constructed at the start of the 4th millennium BC, we see quite a difference or a change in social practices. Because during the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, we see almost no evidence for activity at these monuments. But then, with the adoption of beaker pottery, we do see that these again, after a 500-year break, seem to become a foci for depositional activity. And this depositional activity, it mainly comprises, once again, these deposits of occupational debris containing shards of beaker pottery that seems to deliberately emphasize the domestic aspects of life. Much of this activity seems to have a referential character. It seems to represent interactions between the communities of the living and people who they may or may not have regarded as being their ancestors. Then, staying on the topic of megalithic monuments, but turning our attention to a new type of monument that begins to be constructed around 2500 BC. This represents, again, quite a significant change because people begin building this new megalithic monument type known as wedge tombs after a 500-year-long hiatus in tomb building. These monuments can be seen as a reinvention of a Neolithic or Fourth Millennium megalithic tradition in Ireland. Their design seems to have been strongly influenced by the architecture of pre-existing megaliths, which they were often sited beside. Their main period of use has been firmly dated to the period 2400 to 2000 BC, although deposition continues long after this date. But inside these monuments, the earliest deposits contain multiple burnt and unburnt human remains in association with beaker pottery and often arrowheads. And significantly, these seem to represent the only context in which we find complete beaker pots with human remains. But yet other supra-regionally styled beaker-related objects were clearly excluded. Although we are now aware of a much greater body of evidence for beaker-associated funeral activity in Ireland than previously recognised, the quantities remain low. Some inhumations and cremations that fall within the relevant time period are known, but these are often without beaker pottery or other beaker-related objects. People here do not seem to have been wholly comfortable with placing beaker pottery and objects with human remains in any context other than wedge tombs. And most of the evidence for beakers with human remains comes from these. So we have a total of 14 cremations and 18 inhumations from these monuments. And the bodies that we find inside these were very much the product of highly selective and transformative acts, including burning, fragmentation, deposition, and then dispersal of fragments alongside other humans. And again, this suggests to us that this is portraying and enacting a concern with relationships between the dead, but also between the dead and the living. And again, this has been done in a way that strongly echoes pre-existing practices. Now, the classic single grave burial rite practiced elsewhere is largely absent from Ireland until around 2150 BC, which in some parts of Britain is the same time that we see beaker inhumations occurring for the first time. And the Irish examples of these are very similar to those that we see in northeastern Britain at this time. For example, they're often placed with an assist, with a pot deposited by the head, with objects like boar tusks or bronze knives. But in Ireland, these do not occur with a beaker. Instead, they occur with this new pottery type, Irish bowls, the food vessel tradition, that seem to have been specially created to enable the widespread adoption of this practice of burying crouched single inhumations with accompanying pottery and other grave gifts. Now, the non-ceramic artifacts that are found at beaker-related burials in other countries are mainly found here as stray or single finds, or sometimes in hordes, mainly within bogs. And while this patterning can be very frustrating to study, the context and the condition of these objects demonstrates that people consistently chose highly selective and uniform ways of treating these different artifacts that were type-specific, context-specific, and place-specific. Certain objects were deposited singly, while others, like gold discs, tend to always be deposited in pairs, while others are found in greater numbers, but only ever in single-type hoards. There was clearly a deliberate effort to keep these different types of objects apart from each other and only place them in certain kinds of places. And this suggests there were commonly shared ideas regarding the correct life path for these different object types. This is exemplified by the treatment of certain objects, like these crescent-shaped ornaments that we call lunulae that were often found rolled up. If we turn our attention back to wrist bracers, we see that Fiona Rowe and Anne Woodward showed that there were three main types of stone used in their manufacture: jasper, porcelainite, and a mixture of other fine-grained stones. And all of these, except jasper, had been used in the manufacture of polished stone axes in the fourth millennium. Indeed, some of these are made from the same porcelainite from the northeast of Ireland as some of the axes had been. If we look at the red wrist bracers, sometimes made from jasper or sandstone, we see that these often tend to be snapped in half prior to deposition in a way that the darker coloured wrist bracers are not. And again, in many regards, when we look at the treatment of all of these beaker-associated or beaker-related novelties in Ireland, they're not beaker-associated, we see again that their deposition is echoing the treatment of the copper axe heads, which itself was echoing the treatment of stone axes in the Neolithic, where we saw that international stone axes mainly been placed in wet places in one-type hoards. There's something about keeping these value-laden objects spatially and contextually separate. And such is the uniformity that we see here in their treatment that it's hard to argue that this represents conspicuous consumption. So what is going on? Well, many of these objects, they are locally made, but in an international style. Clearly, they seem to refer to other people and other places, not to the local. Many seem to be esoteric. They were made using craft-working technologies that were required to transform various magical materials like gold or copper or particular types of stone. As we've heard from various people over the last few days, they seem to reflect ideals of craft-working, perhaps hunting, martiality, but most importantly, perhaps what unites them all is they are all bodily ornaments. They all change a person's physical appearance. They all seem to form part of a costume that transformed a person's appearance and perhaps also their identity. And while the deposition of objects together in graves can seem very different to the deposition of them separately and apart in bogs, these may also be thought of as related versions of highly selective transformational acts. In Ireland, these objects do seem to have been worn together as part of a costume prior to deposition. And the most convincing evidence for this is by the 19th century discovery of a wooden box at Corran Bog. And this wooden box contained a pair of sun discs, a pair of wrist bracers, and jet beads. And there's a striking parallel between this and a hoard of similar dress items from Migdale in Scotland, containing ornaments such as jet V perforated buttons, bronze basket-shaped ornaments, and bronze tubular beads. So the deposition of these objects in bogs in Ireland seems to represent the deconstruction of a social identity, unlike that in graves, which seems to be very much focused on the construction of a similar kind of identity. But ultimately, in both cases, the end result is that the objects are made absent. So, to conclude, although I've highlighted a different way of thinking about these, my intention has not been to explain away difference. We should expect practices and things to emerge differently in different regions. To better understand this widespread phenomenon, it must be considered in terms of the local worlds of the small-scale societies that were interconnected together by these various super-regional elements that we consider part of the Beaker phenomenon. People were highly interconnected at this time. They had intersecting and overlapping webs of contact. They had a widespread set of shared cultural traditions. But as we've seen throughout the last few days, in various different places, they were enacting these shared ideas and practices in regionally distinctive ways. And for me, this very much accounts for the high levels of both convergence and divergence that we see in the archaeological record across Europe at this time. In the case of Ireland, there was a strong concern with insular traditions, and this seems to represent efforts on the parts of both newcomers and pre-existing populations to integrate the new and the old, perhaps to construct or emphasize a shared social identity. Thank you.